before we get too caught up in the Sony hack drama, let's remember that there are Koreans out there who still allow creative expression. Hill of Freedom is a South Korean film written and directed by Sang-soo and stars Ryo Kase, Young-hwa, Moon So-ri, Kim Eui-sung, and Yeo-jeong. I tried my best. Hill of Freedom starts out with Mori, played by Ryo Kase, who is a Japanese language teacher going to Korea to get back this woman he loves, but he can't find her. So instead, he begins to write undated letters addressed to her, talking about his search for her, the friends he met along the way, and this affair he begins with another woman. And eventually, Kwon, played by Young-hwa, finds these letters but drops them out of order, and because they're undated, she puts them back together, tries to read through them, and the rest of this movie is a series of vignettes that follow these unordered letters about Mori's adventures. Now, Hill of Freedom was a very last minute watch for me. It was screened here at the Cinema and Originals Festival as part of their international program, the same one Winter Sleep was part of, and because I had already seen Winter Sleep, I wasn't really, I didn't really want to watch anything else, but I figured that I had enough time to watch Hill of Freedom because this movie is an hour long. It's like an hour, 5 minutes. And I really didn't know what to expect because this is the first Korean movie I've ever seen in my entire life. I'm pretty sure my friends are gonna start telling me to watch more Korean movies, but as it stands, this is the first Korean movie I've ever seen. And you know what? I'm really, really surprised. Turns out Hill of Freedom is a really interesting movie. It's definitely very charming also, but more importantly, it's this real cool narrative experiment with the way it uses its structure and the way it uses language. The very first thing you'll notice about Hill of Freedom is that it looks really, really simple. I mean, in terms of production design, it doesn't even look like they really decorated any of the sets they used. And, the cinematography is very handheld camera quality. I totally get it if you think this movie looks cheap because it honestly does look like they just filmed it on a bunch of handheld digital cameras. But I actually think that you kind of get used to it after a while. I think it really fits the tone very well, and I think you'll get used to it if you view the vignettes in this movie as Kwon interpreting Mori's letters in her head. Don't look at this movie as, these things actually happening in real life. Try to just see them as the way she is imagining them, as she reads the letters. But the really cool thing with the fragmented narrative structure of this movie is that it really forces the audience to kind of figure out what's happening and what happened first, what happened later, and it also stops us from judging the characters too quickly because some people might kind of freak out when they realize that Mori is essentially cheating on Kwon with this other woman. It's not a spoiler, like, that's really kind of part of the whole thing. But, it's cool how I think this movie is trying to tell us, at least the way I interpret it, that reality isn't necessarily a string of causally related events. We only get to see bits and pieces of Mori's personality and his life through the things he chooses to say to Kwon in his letter. So I personally don't think we can judge Mori that is easily based on what he's writing. The fragmented narrative structure really challenges us about our notions of what a movie storyline should be like. Here, I think they're really trying to deconstruct that and show that random things can happen for no reason because it's trying to imitate reality. But you know what? If you're not a fan of the structure, it's over very quickly anyway. It's an hour long, and it never really overstays its welcome. So the experiment really never does get that old. My only real issue with the editing in this movie is that the way they transition from Kwon moving from one letter to another is really, really tiresome. It gets tiresome very quickly because it just kind of shows her turning the page and going to the next letter, and it really takes you out of the movie constantly, and I really wish they just didn't do it. But by far, this movie's biggest strength, in my opinion, is the way it uses English as the primary spoken language in the movie, even if it's a second language for both the Japanese and the Koreans. Because obviously Mori can't talk to the Koreans in Japanese and the Koreans can't talk back to Mori in Korean. They both have to find the middle ground. That middle ground is English, but none of them are really that fluent in English. But what happens is that it's really interesting because all the dialogue you hear, you feel like there's something lost in translation, but at the same time, the things these people want to say to each other, they have to bring it down to like a very straight to the point style. So what happens is that we, the audience, are forced to become interpreters almost, translators for what they're saying, because if something sounds kind of off, or if something sounds a bit too overdramatic or whatever, we have to kind of figure out ourselves what they really want to say, what their real mood is. That's what really sets Hill of Freedom apart. Like, it really demands so much from the audience, and its simplicity is very deceptive. And I think, that's the one thing that no other movie this year really can boast about. The characters in this movie are very simple, but I think they're emotionally complex enough to make the story kind of unpredictable. You don't know what Mori's gonna do, you don't know what Kwon's gonna do by the ending, and I think that Hong Sang-soo understood that his narrative experiment was kind of crazy enough that he didn't need to make characters that complex. It might have kind of made everything convoluted. And again, speaking of Hong Sang-soo, I think he recognized that his directing didn't need to be so in our faces either. So he just really lets the actors do their thing without doing much more than just zooming in once in a while, panning left or right. Again, if you really can't get into this movie style, you might blame like the stilted delivery of all the dialogue on the director. But again, if you just kind of interpret this as a result of the language barrier, or if you interpret the entire movie as the way Kwon is seeing it in her mind, then you can kind of get past this. And it could be argued that all the actors in this movie aren't really that expressive. Again, though, you could also argue that it's just because of the language barrier. I mean, after all, when the Korean actors talk to each other in the movie, they seem fine. If there's one thing I think the actors do very well, though, it's playing tipsy. I think their tipsiness is very believable because when you're tipsy, you're not like crazy drunk, but you're just kind of a bit woozy. You're still coherent. But I guess my biggest problem with the movie really has to do with the acting, because I feel like they really should have been much more expressive, especially Ryokase as Mori, because you don't show expression just through dialogue alone. And I feel like the way Ryokase was playing Mori was that he should have been way more distressed than he was. There's no way he could have been as calm and unconflicted as he was. If his character really had trouble finding this woman he loves, and had is conflicted about starting an affair with another woman, I really kind of thought that there's no way he could have been this collected about it. There's really not much you can say about a 1 hour movie, but I will say that Hill of Freedom, for what it is actually really good in my opinion, because I think the experiment is interesting enough, and the interpretations you can get from this experiment are endless enough, especially for an hour-long movie, and especially for the ending, which leaves a lot of things open-ended, and it's very open to discussion. But what did you guys think of Hill of Freedom? If you've seen it, did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.